Everyone. Good to see you all here. My name is Pastor Kyle Severson. I serve as associate to the bishop in the Metropolitan Chicago Synod and have the fortunate pleasure of staffing the Constitution Review Committee. And we have a number of those folks on our call this morning. So I'm going to let the Constitution Review Committee introduce themselves. We'll start with Secretary Clausen.
I am Erin Clausen. I serve as your elected secretary to the Synod. I also serve on the Constitution Review Committee. And I'm the person that you get if you write Metropolitan Chicago Secretary at gmail.com. So if you end up with questions, I'll put that in the chat to everybody. But if you end up with questions after today that don't get answered with later, I'm the person who will be fielding those and them on to somebody else. Let's see. Mike, do you want to introduce yourself next?
I think it cut out for a second. Mike,
oh, Michael, do you want to introduce yourself next? No.
Michael Stady?
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm Pastor Michael Stady. I'm retired, but currently I'm serving as a part-time interim at Acacia Park Lutheran in Norridge. And I'm pleased to be able to be on this committee. I have a long history of working with congregational constitutions, from helping congregations to write through them when I've been a member or leading them, but also through Constitution Review Committees. So thank you. Glad you're all able to be here. We believe this should be really helpful for you.
And our wonderful presenter for today who serves on the committee as well, John?
Well, we'll find out about the wonderful part later on. My name is John Nicholas. I'm a member at All Saints Lutheran Church in Palatine, and kind of stole some of my thunder for my presentation because I had a slide with all your names on it. But that's okay. We'll just power through that when we get to it.
Correct. I think you can take it away from here.
All right, so we'll share my screen. Is everybody seeing that now?
Yes.
All right, terrific. Well, again, welcome and thank you for joining us in today's webinar, Organizing for Mission, Updating Your Congregation's Constitution. Around 20 years ago, I was introduced to my first GPS, or Global Positioning System device. I was hooked, and just a few days later, there was one stuck on my windshield. I named it Nicole, mostly because it was set to an Australian accent, and Nicole Kidman was the only Aussie I could think of at the time. And the screen was about half the size of my current smartphone, but it was just the coolest thing to me. And without breaking my arm, patting myself on the back, among my friends, I was known as Maps Nicholas decades before the invention of these GPS. But since that first ride with Nicole, the number of times my GPS was not mapping my drive is quite honestly probably less than a dozen. Going to work? Yep. Going to church? Of course. Grocery store? Check. Every trip, every time was literally my motto, much to the consternation of my lovely bride. It has become as automatic to me as putting the car in gear. And the thing is, around Northern Illinois, I really don't need it, but I still use it. And I do that for a couple of reasons. First, I like to make sure that the map reflects just what I'm seeing. And second, it leads to familiarity with use of the GPS so that I'm not trying to remember how to use it when I need to use it. Because occasionally my planned route needs an unexpected adjustment. Sometimes the adjustments are because I've decided not to go someplace or I add a destination. But oftentimes the route itself is what causes the change of course. For instance, a street loaded with potholes. Now I know this story draws thinly veiled parallels to the reason you are likely attending this webinar. First, we want to become familiar with our constitutions so that we know that the way our congregation functions is in line with how we projected it to work. And secondly, when the road gets a little bumpy, we want to address the situation quickly and accurately to get our congregations back on track. A well-composed constitution affords us the ability to achieve those goals and more. As you embark on this important mission, you will gain a greater awareness of the scope of your constitution. And as you continue to keep it updated, you will become more familiar with it and know how to quickly reference it for your mission. So let's get to it. Today's webinar is hosted, as we learned earlier, by the Metropolitan Chicago Synod's Constitution Review Committee. The committee members are Pastor Erin Clausen of Prince of Peace in Schaumburg. She's also the Metropolitan Chicago Synod Secretary. Pastor Kyle Severson, Associate to the Bishop at the Metropolitan Chicago Synod. Pastor Jason Gombicki, Wicker Park Lutheran Church in Chicago. Interim Pastor Michael Stady of Acacia Park Lutheran Church in Norridge. Carol Rectoris, she's a member at Christus Victor in Elk Grove Village. Frank Imhoff, a member at Holy Trinity in Elgin. And again, I'm John Nicholas, and I'm a member at All Saints in Palatine. The purpose of this committee is charged with the responsibility to ensure that the Synod's own constitution is up to date with the ELCA's model constitution for synods that was adopted at the most recent churchwide assembly. The committee also drafts amendments to the Synod's constitution that are to be voted on at the upcoming assemblies, which, by the way, the assembly will be the place to be on June 3rd. The committee also reviews the constitutions of each congregation in the Synod to ensure that there are no conflicts within the document and between it and the model constitution. Before we get to the constitution update portion of this webinar, the committee would like to thank the 44 respondents to the survey recently sent to all the 173 congregations of the Synod. So let's do a quick review of the survey. As you can see, just over 20%, or 42% of the respondents reported that the year their constitution was last updated was in the past 3 years. That jumps to more than 55% over the last 5 years and more than 68% in the last 10. The oldest response, as you can see, is 1994. And it occurred, and then there were 60% of the people that were unsure of the last update or that it occurred prior to 1988. Moving on to the questions, I see the Constitution as a valuable resource for mission. Nearly 80% agreed or strongly agreed that a Constitution is a valuable resource. 16%, they're on the fence, and a tick under 5% do not agree. Next question was, we refer regularly to the Constitution as we plan and organize the congregation. Just over 2/3 referred to their constitutions regularly. About 14% are unsure if they do, and 19% generally don't refer to it at all. The third question was, I know where to find the model constitution for congregations and other resources to help update our constitution. Almost 84% know where to find the resources needed to make the updates. Under 5% are unsure, and 12% do not know where to look. Next question was, I am aware that every 3 years, the model constitution for congregations has updates that need to be voted on by my congregation. Half the respondents knew that the triennial updates needed to be voted on. 14% were unsure, and more than 1/3 were unaware of this requirement. Next, I understand the process required for updating the Constitution. Nearly 2/3 know how to update their Constitution. A quarter weren't as sure, and 14% are ready to look how to get this important task completed. The next question was, I know who I could reach out to for support in thinking through the process and other questions. Whopping 70% know where to go for assistance. Just over 18% could use a tip, while nearly 12% are ready for some serious support. So why? First off, it's a good idea. It provides the foundation and direction for the congregation to build their mission upon. Second, it is a statement that the congregation is a part of the global Christian community. And finally, it's a legal thing. Really, Illinois Statute 805, the Religious Corporation Act, outlines the legal requirements, and having documentation of policies is a part of it. Developing a nonprofit or profit organizational document from a blank page is a long and arduous process. Fortunately, the ELCA has done most of the heavy lifting on our behalf. We'll get to some of the specifics of that shortly. But first, when talking about the an ELCA constitution, there are a few definitions we should point out. A constitution is just a collection of provisions, bylaws, and continuing resolutions. A chapter is those provisions, bylaws, and continuing resolutions grouped together by subject. An amendment is simply any change made to the Constitution. Let's take a little side trip and look closer at advance notification for amendments. When an amendment to your Constitution is proposed, there is a timeline to allow sufficient time to consider the amendment. First, the amendment must be brought to the Congregation Council at least 60 days before a congregation meeting. Then the council must bring the amendment with their recommendation to the congregation at least 30 days before the meeting. This advance notice applies only to provisions and bylaw amendments. Continuing resolutions do not require advance notice to the congregation. But if you are seeking a congregation vote on one, it's probably good practice to give them heads up. A provision is a section of the Constitution that stipulates a condition or requirement. Another side trip. Amendments to a provision require 2 congregation votes. At the first meeting, an approval by a majority of voters present, and then it must be ratified without change at the next meeting by a 2/3 vote. There is an exception though. All the updates to the model constitution approved at the Triennial Churchwide Assembly are ratified by a majority vote at a congregation meeting. So you can go ahead and pencil in this vote for your first meeting after the 2025 Churchwide Assembly. It's going to be in Phoenix in August. I'm no meteorologist, but I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that's going to be a hot time in that town. Next, our bylaw, a section of the Constitution that stipulates a condition or requirement. Does that sound familiar? Quick note, bylaw amendments require only a 2/3 vote at a single meeting. And I think this is where we begin to show the difference between provisions and bylaws. Provisions are those elements that are foundational to your congregation's mission. As you saw, it takes 2 meetings. So in most instances, it would be a minimum of 14 months for a proposed change to be enacted. Bylaws are a tad more responsive to your congregation's needs. They are by no means fast acting, but they can be voted on and approved in as few as 2 months. A continuing resolution, a section of the Constitution that stipulates a condition or requirement. Am I getting redundant? Sure am. But continuing resolutions are gifted with a fair amount of immediacy. If by chance an issue and a solution is raised at a congregation meeting, a continuing resolution could be presented and approved at that meeting. Also, if the council determines a particular course of action, such as adding responsibility to a current committee, is an appropriate response to a new situation, they can authorize that at any council meeting. And finally, as you peruse the model constitution, you'll note that the term church appears in a couple different ways. Capitalized, it refers to the universal church. Lowercase, it simply refers to the ELCA. Moving to codification, seasoned constitutioners, yep, Microsoft just confirmed I invented a brand new word. They can recognize straight away what type of component a given section is just by the number that precedes it. A little sidebar, Your Honor. Every section of a congregation's constitution begins with the letter C, just as every section of a synod's constitution begins with the letter S. This is because the constitution of each expression of the ELCA, churchwide synod and congregation, may make reference to a specific provision of another constitution. These prefixes help identify which document the reference pertains to. Anybody crack the code on how the ELCA came up with those letters? So for our discussion today, every provision in your constitution begins with the letter C. The C is followed by the chapter number where it is found in the Constitution. That combination is followed by a dot and the sequence where it appears in the chapter and the sequence word appears in the chapter, and then another dot. Oops, went too fast there. There are 20 chapters in your Constitution. The provision numbers for all but 6 of them are preceded by an asterisk. That little star makes those 14 chapters required provisions. We'll get to what that means in just a few minutes. And there are 6 remaining chapters that are not required but highly recommended, and that asterisk is absent from those provisions. Easy peasy, right? The model constitution contains no bylaws whatsoever. However, this is how your congregation puts its stamp on the basic document. You can tell it's a bylaw because another sequence number gets added to the end of the original provision number, followed by another dot. Cinchy, no? Whoops, just kidding. There are no required bylaws. Like bylaws, the model constitution contains no continuing resolutions either. This enables even greater fine tuning to make your constitution a truly unique reflection of your congregation. To designate a continuing resolution, the provision number is followed by a letter and a 2-digit number, which is followed by a dot. The letter is used as a sequence identifier, and the number is the last 2 digits of the year the continuing resolution was adopted. Exciting stuff, am I right? And another sidebar, while it was once a common practice, including the date of adoption after the text of an amendment is no longer required or recommended. So getting back to the meaning of that little star, it's big. The asterisk indicates that a provision must be included in your constitution exactly as written in the model constitution. No ifs, ands, or buts. Sans asterisk, go ahead, edit to your heart's desire. Have a blast. Even delete it if you want. Well, that's not entirely accurate. Edits and or additions cannot contradict, refute, negate, or undermine any required provision. And I know I'm getting redundant again, but I cannot stress this enough. If you do make changes, they cannot conflict with any part of any expression's constitution, including your own. And that's what your Constitution Review Committee is here for. We'll review your document to make sure any modification does not cause trouble down the road. Beyond that, there are options. These are the 6 chapters that are designed to assist congregations in tailoring their document to meet their organization's needs. While the language is fully editable, it does provide a baseline to build upon. Modifying these chapters should reflect the structure of your congregation and its operation. As an example, the provisions in Chapter 13 could group different types of committees specific to the congregation by function or term, a standing committee versus a task-based committee. Accompanying bylaws could name those committees and include their structure, i.e. number of members and term limits. Adding a continuing resolution could include the specific duties and responsibilities of each committee. In addition, there are 34 provisions listed here that have alternatives within them that need to be selected or defined to reflect your congregation's operations. But watch out, these can get tricky. As an example, in C5.03J, by including too many of the options, it could mean that the congregation retains the power to elect every single member of every single committee within the congregation. This means that the nominating committee will need to bring an expansive slate of volunteers to each congregation meeting. Now, if that's how your church operates, that's okay. But also ensure elsewhere in your constitution, there is a process for midterm replacements. Also beware of language that is too broad. I've reviewed a constitution that stated all matters of the church must be voted on by the congregation. With that language, even a light bulb change would require congregation approval. Can't imagine that's how any congregation operates. But be sure that your constitution reads, say to a member of your Synod's review committee, just the way your congregation operates. And then there is the review committee. As ELCA members, your congregation is to forward a copy of your constitution to the Synod. We'll make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and maybe look at a few other things to ensure you have a document that provides direction and guidance for your congregation's mission. And it's probably best if you do this before presenting it to your congregation for approval. Just be sure to give us sufficient time to review it beforehand. It is a lofty goal, but we hope to one day have all 173 constitutions within the Synod current and up to date. Well, that was a lot. At this time, we can take a moment to answer any questions that you may have, but please note, it can be very hard to answer questions specific to your constitution without having it in front of us. But if you do have a question that requires that level of response, please reach out to the review committee through the Synod secretary, and we will be more than happy to set up a meeting where we can work through those subjects. With that, do we have any questions?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What if your congregation doesn't approve one of the required provisions?
Well, Secretary Clausen?
Because of the way our governance is structured, all required provisions are automatically in effect for all congregations, regardless of whether your congregation actually approves them or not. So because we are Lutherans and want to do everything with good order and in good order, we ask that you present those to your congregation so that they understand that those are that those are in effect, and adopt those as being in effect. But if you were to need to come to the Synod for anything, the Synod or the ELCA church-wide organization would operate as though those required provisions were. Mike, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the decently and in good order is a good reason for that also. It's also to make sure that there's uniformity across the church in a way, especially what my experience has been, it's usually in the area of the pastor or the call process or early on, and to make sure that as rostered leaders go from one congregation to the other, they know that they'll be treated the same, and then also the same way that the congregation knows that whatever rostered leader comes in will also have to follow these same rules, so it doesn't change every time you have a new leadership from rostered members.
Yeah, I fully understand why. It's a matter of, at our last congregational meeting, which was just a couple of weeks ago, there was a couple of the required changes that they didn't like some of the wording. We did convince them to vote yes for it, but I was just curious what you do if they vote no.
Well, and the other thing is that you would then forward that constitution to the office of the secretary, to the
Right.
team, and we would send it back to you and say that we can't approve these provisions because they are not in accordance with the required ELCA model constitution.
Another reason why there really is no choice, and I understand too, I think I understand what you're asking, is because some congregations, as we look back, have not updated theirs since 1994, but there are some that even go prior to the ELCA formation. And so it's a very different call process, very different nomenclature and things like that. So if that would happen, my guess would be, we hear that report when you turn in that we don't approve this for this reason, it'd be a great opportunity for a Synod staff person or the bishop to be able to have that conversation with the congregation and the leadership. Why is this an issue for you? Because often it may reflect other sort of things that are going on or just a lack of understanding. And it'd be an opportunity to be able to make a contact and help educate and clarify information.
Yeah, I'm intending to send this to you. The pastor just wanted to talk to a few people before we sent you the information. We did pass, but because there was concerns, we said we'd be talking to the Senate. My other question is that I guess we didn't realize that even the continuing resolutions and the bylaws should have started with a C. Our bylaws start with like a BL, and our continuing resolutions start with a CR. Is that an issue?
It's not, because those are not required.
Okay.
We recommend, the ELCA recommends a process by which every congregations would look the same, because they found that to be effective. But that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that when you send it to us and it looks that way, we might say, hey, as an editorial amendment, you may want to change these letters. But we wouldn't say we won't accept this constitution on the basis of having the letters different.
Okay, all
Another
right,
thing
so
that
that could be something we change next time.
Right, yes. And
Okay.
another thing that often happens is congregations may have separate documents. So they have their constitution, and then after that they have their bylaws, and after that they have their continuing resolutions. And we recommend that they all be included in one document, because it's the easiest way for you as a congregation to know all of the things that are pertinent to each other at the same time. But we wouldn't reject your constitution if you have it in a different order or in a different way. We just send, again, a note of recommendation that maybe that's something you want to consider.
Okay, you're right, we do have ours after, not included in. Okay, that's interesting.
What are some examples of a continuing resolution?
I would
I
say
have,
for, go ahead, Michael.
in a previous congregation, the ones that I had put in and through the council, the standard IRS mileage rate will be the rate that reimbursed. That way, at every year, you don't have to, at budget time, you don't have to start arguing, well, I don't like this, it should be 50 cents or 55 cents or whatever, things along that line. That was the first one that always pops into mind for me, and other things along that line. John, do you have some other suggestions?
Well, as I was talking about, for our constitution, I like to see continuing resolutions as the duties and responsibilities of each committee. Those are easier and faster to change as your committee changes and things like that. A technology committee might find something that they need to add to their list of things to do. It's quick and easy to add a continuing resolution that says the technology committee will now take care of the copier, as opposed to making that a provision or a bylaw that takes a little bit longer to enact that.
For those provisions that are required, is it possible to put in a bylaw along with one of those provisions? For instance, I'm thinking of, there's a required section that says that the congregation will elect like representatives to the Synod meetings, like this meeting coming up in June. And we only have congregational meetings probably once a year typically. We're not going to select our representatives in January when we have our annual meeting typically. Is it possible to put in a bylaw that says that if a congregational meeting is not feasible in that time frame, that the congregational council can approve our representatives to the Synod meetings?
I would recommend against that being a bylaw, because you never want to take away congregational power unnecessarily. Instead, I would recommend that you just simply add at your regular annual meeting that the congregation will vote on allowing the council to appoint or elect at the appropriate time. So rather than having that in your actual bylaws, which would also work, but can be a little bit more tricky, I would just make that a regular part of your annual meeting.
Okay, but
And what that
that's
does,
sort
it
of
allows,
overriding what's in the provision, the required provision, it would seem.
well, that's where it becomes tricky, right? So if you worded it very carefully, as you just did, that if a congregational meeting is not feasible during this time, but then you have to also explain what do we mean by the words if it's not feasible. Like, I can call a special congregational meeting with 2 weeks notice. So if we have 6 months notice of the assembly, then what does that mean? So that's why you could do it if you worded it very, very carefully, but it's probably easier for your congregation to make that vote. And it also gives the whole congregation every year the ability to say, but we don't like the way the council's been doing this, rather than having a whole bunch of them have to say, no, we want to change this bylaw. And so it just retains a little bit of the balance of power that we're usually seeing in these kinds of documents.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Are there other questions for our team?
I was just going to share that when we formed our committee, one of the things that we did is one of us went in and took our existing constitution that had been behind more than the 3 years and added in the updates and revision mode. And then as a committee, we would meet and display the Constitution with the revisions so that you could read it in context and talk about it in context. And we would make updates to the parts that weren't required wording kind of together. And that was really helpful for us to get through things and have good discussions. So if you're looking at doing this at your church, I guess that's an approach I think you should consider using.
And I have just recently discovered, probably within the last 6 months, that there is, if you put it into a Word document, there is through the review system to compare two documents. And
Right.
it will highlight those that are different, where they are different. So if you're not sure, rather than going line by line, having to figure out, does that match or not match, you could be able to do this as well.
Also, many congregations are able to do this process, especially if they've done it over and over again, without any help or assistance. But I want to reiterate again that I and the whole Constitution Review Committee are available to you and to your congregation. So especially if there are things you really don't understand, don't hesitate to email or call and say, you know, my congregation is struggling. Can you come and meet with us on some evening or some day, you know, that kind of thing. Or can you explain this to me so that I can share it with my council? We are happy to be a resource for all of those things.
Mhm.
And between us all, I don't know how many years of experience we have, but we've seen and heard just about everything, I think. So we can talk you through almost any situation.
Any other
Any other
questions?
I did have a slide with some links on there, but I figured out that you can't click on these links anyway. But if you do Google ELCA Constitution, Model Constitution, your first option should wind up being the ELCA Model Constitution page. So that's one way to do it. And then if not, you can just, as Pastor Aaron sent you earlier, that link for her email. She will get you hooked up with the link to the Model Constitution. And then finally, I want to thank everybody. Thank you. We're as excited as you are to begin this journey, and please know that our team is more than happy to assist you and your team research or reach your goal of a fully updated Constitution.
Thank you. This was interesting. I learned a few new things.
And that's
Thank
good
you.
to hear.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming. Again, contact us if you need anything, and many blessings on your ministry. Do what it is that God has called you to do.